Good morning and welcome everybody. I am Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you here to the discussion today to hear the latest results from the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker for the results just taken at the beginning of August, so a month after the general election. It's a quarterly survey of over 2,000 people in Scotland. Now I'd just like to introduce our speakers. I'll do all the introductions at the beginning and then hand over one by one to the people to speak. So Scott Edgar is a Senior Research Manager with the Diffley Partnership. Scott will present the latest findings of the Economy Tracker, which shows economic confidence and buying intentions over time. Now, we've almost been doing this for 3 years. It'll be 3 years in November, and it helps us to understand and monitor attitudes and public opinion. Scott will be followed by Lesley Gray, who is the Strategic Insights Director for the food and drink industry at Kantar. So Kantar's World Panel provide brands and retailers with unique 360-degree understanding of consumer behaviour around the world. And I am really looking forward to hearing Lesley Ann's insights and how they tally with the kind of insights we're getting from the Economy Tracker in Scotland. Lesley will be followed by Manira Ahmad, the Chief Officer with Public Health Scotland. And Manira leads strategic programmes through the multidisciplinary approach that they have at Public Health Scotland. She's had a varied career spanning both public and private sectors, including working in the financial industry, where she was involved in global workforce planning and investments in offshoring. Is that right? I said it's got offshore trading. I was like, no, it's offshoring. Anyway, right, without further ado, over to Scott.
Thank you very much, Susan. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along. So, as Susan said, I'm Scott Edgar. I'm Senior Research Manager at the Diffley Partnership, and I'm presenting the latest findings from the 12th wave of the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. So, for those of you who have not been here before, the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker was set up as a quarterly survey tool which measures the most important facets of our lives and decision making in Scotland, those being our society, our economy and our environment. And we produced Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker in partnership with the David Hume Institute. Fieldwork was conducted between the 1st to 5th of August, earlier this month. We issued invitations via the Scott Pulse panel, and there's colleagues from Scott Pulse in the room today. And we received 2,227 responses from the adult population, aged 16 plus across Scotland, and that's what we've been doing for every wave. So for every wave, we've been getting 2,000 responses from people across Scotland on a quarterly basis. So you can imagine how we've built up quite a long time series of public attitudes, priorities, how people are feeling about the economy and how people are feeling about Scotland's direction. One thing to note as well, obviously, is that timing does matter in these things. And the fieldwork was on the weekend where there were the riots happening down in England. And I think it's just worth flagging that as we kind of consider some of the findings. It was in the week after the incidents in Southport. So, one of the questions we've been asking for a long time is this kind of really broad question around whether people in Scotland feel that Scotland's direction of travel is going in the right or wrong direction. And what we've seen prior to this wave was that in May, we had the highest proportion we'd seen over the whole time series, so we're saying that Scotland was headed in the wrong direction. That's decreased by 7 percentage points this wave down to 56%. Now that's still a majority. It's hardly like a kind of massive jump of optimism when people are really feeling things are going in the right direction. But what you can see is there's been an increase of about 4 percentage points for the proportion of Scots who feel that things in Scotland are moving in the right direction, but also a big increase in don't know. And if you get time to read the report, you'll see we reflect on that. It kind of does feel like the nation's at a bit of a kind of crossroads. People are kind of waiting to see what happens next, I think. And I think we're going to see that over the remainder of the results. There's variations on this in terms of like proportions based on demographics. Older people are more likely to think things in Scotland are going in the wrong direction than younger people. But yeah, as you can see, basically, that kind of steady increase that we've been seeing in the proportion saying things are going in the wrong direction has fallen a bit in this wave. And one of the things that we've been tracking over the 12 waves are what are people in Scotland's priorities. So what we asked them is what are the top 3 issues facing people in Scotland today? And if you take it back 3 months ago, and the general election had just been announced when we last did this, I was standing there going, healthcare and NHS are the top 2 priorities for Scots. Now that remains the case, but what we see is we've seen a kind of sharp decline in the proportion of people who are citing cost of living and inflation as amongst our top 3 priorities. So a 4 percentage point decrease from the last wave, but a 12 percentage point decrease from this time last year. So if you'd been at this presentation in August 23, that figure would have been at 48%. It would have been neck and neck with healthcare and the NHS. So what that kind of tells us is that perhaps we're going to see a broadening of issues that people find important over the next few waves. And you can see there's not really like a contender that's like jumped out and it's, you know, increasing to become the next sort of one that's catching up. You can see there's this massive sort of, you know, group of issues that are all broadly around the kind of same percent. So you see poverty and inequality, 18% of people cite that amongst their top 3 issues facing Scotland, followed by the economy, housing, trust in politics, which had been on a kind of increase over the waves previous to this. That's had a 3 percentage point decrease, but it's still 16%. It's still one of the biggest issues that people in Scotland feel that they're facing is in relation to trust in politics. And then immigration. Now, immigration is at the highest level it's been at in terms of a top 3 issue for the whole time series. So that's increased 3 percentage points this time to 13%. And that's the highest that we've recorded over the course of the Understanding Scotland economy tracker. If we, you know, dig a bit deeper into who are people who are more likely to select immigration as one of their top 3 issues, it's you know, older people aged 55 to 64 at 17%, but it's actually lower amongst those 65 plus at 12%. So it's a bit of a mixed picture within that sort of prioritisation that we see there. One of the kind of strongest drivers of where it's a priority is actually the Scottish indices of multiple deprivation. So those in SIMD1, the most deprived neighbourhoods, 17% would cite immigration as amongst the top 3 issues, compared to 9% of those in SIMD5 in Scotland's most affluent neighbourhoods. So there is something perhaps going on there. And as we say, if the cost of living and inflation continues to decrease in terms of people's priorities, we would expect to see some other issues begin to fill that gap, a bit of a broadening of people's priorities, if you like, which has implications as we think ahead to, I know we've just had an election there, but as we think ahead to like 2026 and how parties are going to set out their stall, they're going to have to be thinking about what issues are most important to people and which ones that they've got power to do things about in Scotland. We also ask people about their economic priorities. And what's interesting in this is this has been quite stable for a few waves now. So this is distinct from sort of broader policy issues that we've seen on the last slide. This is more around issues that are specifically to do, you know, with, you know, either their own income or the economy as a whole. Cost of living and inflation remains the top, you know, economic priority of people in Scotland at 58%, 6 and 10, a 2 percentage point decline last time. But I think the most striking thing from this graph is the sort of lack of movement on the bars this time. What you can see is that, you know, not a lot of the measures have actually moved very much. However, there has been a 3% increase in people placing pension amongst their top 3 priorities. And I'll give a little bit of a plug for some other David Hume Institute work recently on the Great Risk Transfer, which is well worth going and having a read of. It was published last week. But what's interesting about that is kind of digging into the demographics while we're writing the report to look at the pensions. It's probably not a surprise to anybody that only 5% of those aged 16 to 34 prioritise their pension, compared to 20% of those 65 plus as an economic issue. So there's a very clear, it may seem obvious, but a very clear age driver in terms of how people think about their pensions and the kind of grand scheme of their economic priorities. And kind of to go along with that decline that we saw in the proportion of people placing the cost of living and inflation amongst their top priorities, people are getting, I always kind of say this, getting a wee bit more optimistic, not quite flipping over into full optimism, but they're not as negative as they were about economic conditions even just a few waves ago. So if we look at this wave, we've seen a kind of a big decrease in the amount of people who report that their general economic conditions have got worse over the last 12 months. What that hasn't translated to, though, is people saying that they've got better. So really what we're seeing is it's really sort of gathering around that about the same, but the negativity is sort of subsiding. So I bet maybe at some point it'll eventually get to some kind of positivity, which this graph's really, really good at showing. So what this graph here shows is basically if you take all the people who say that the economic conditions have got much better or worse, and then you take the amount that were worse away from better, you then get a net score. And that net score, if it's positive, it means that people are on the whole saying things are getting better or will get better. And if it's negative, they're saying that they are worse or getting worse. Now, what we can see here is that in August 2022, that white line is about economic general economic conditions, and that blue line, sorry, over the last 12 months, and the blue line is general economic conditions over the next 12 months. And traditionally, people's perceptions of general economic conditions are always worse than their own. That's something that we found consistently over this series. People are more likely to think that the economy as a whole is worse than their own conditions. But what we see in August 22, well, around January 23 really, was we were at the absolute floor for general economic conditions. You can see that's a net negative score of about 90% at that time. So nearly everybody was saying things are worse than they were a year ago. We've got up to minus 41%, so it's not quite positive, but you can see that the direction of travel for the last, several waves now, for nearly 2 years actually, has been an increase in some kind of optimism. People slowly think things are getting better generally. But that sharp increase that we see in that one over the waves isn't actually matched by the financial circumstances. So while that's going up, it's not going up at the same rate. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of shakes out over the next few months. It's kind of an interesting relationship to think about, that people are maybe not prioritising the cost of living as much. They're a little bit more positive, but not quite willing to be completely positive about the economy. And then they're making their assessments of their own income as well. And that takes us on to basically things to do with financial resilience. So financial resilience, we've run these questions a few times. And what these questions look at are, could you shoulder an emergency expense? So what we find is that 75% of people say that they're confident that they could shoulder an emergency expense of £100, and that's up 3% on last time we asked it. And 56% are confident that they could shoulder an emergency expense of £500 without borrowing, and that's up 4 from last time. But I think it is worth dwelling on that for a moment, that we're saying 56% of people say that they're confident that they could shoulder an emergency expense of £500. That's a lot of people who are not confident that they can shoulder that kind of expense, which an expense of £500, well, no, that can pop up sort of anywhere as an emergency expense. It's a very precarious position to be in if you feel you can't cover a cost of £500. And that's worse for households with children. So what we see is actually that, 33% of households with children are not confident that they could meet an emergency expense of £100. And if we look at £500, 6 in 10 are not confident that they could meet an emergency expense of £500 with households with children. So there's an imbalance in kind of people's experience of basically financial precarity. And then we also ask people, are you confident that you could get another job within 3 months if necessary? And 52% of people say they are confident in relation to that. And then we also ask, are you confident you could pay your housing costs if they increased in the next 6 months? And 62% say that they are confident that if their rent or mortgage went up in the next 6 months, that they could meet those extra costs. And that's up 6 percentage points from the last time that we ran that question. And one thing we've been tracking for quite a long time now as well is people's, behaviours with regards to responding to rising costs and inflation. And we've kind of consistently seen the top ones are cutting down on non-essential purchases, cutting down on leisure activities, and reducing energy use. And we've seen falls in the proportion of people who are reporting these behaviours. That could potentially be seasonal as well, given that it's summer, so people are probably less likely in this instance to report that they're cutting down on their heating costs, etc. And always, you can see it bounces up a little bit over the course of the when we get into the winter. So the next wave, when we're all standing here freezing, then it might be a little bit, different once the weather's kind of shifted, and also with some of the announcements that we've seen with regards to, cutting up winter fuel payments and things like that. We might see those begin to increase again. Stable. But one of the things that we ask is, whether people have kind of bought less fruit and vegetables as part of their, attempts to sort of stem the tide of rising costs. And 22% report that they've bought less fruit and vegetables. That's down 3 percentage points on the last wave. Which brings me nicely to my final slide before I hand over. And basically, people have reported changes to what they eat. So we ran these, this is the second time that we've run these questions. And we find that 6 in 10 say they've reduced the number of times that they take away or the number of times that they dine out in response to rising food costs. That's down 4 percentage points on the last time that we asked it. 45% of people say that they are more likely to shop for food based on price rather than health, down 8 percentage points from last time we asked it. And 25% say that they're, more likely to be consuming more packaged or processed foods instead of fresh alternatives as a result of price. That's higher again amongst households with children. So 34% of households with children report that they're consuming more packaged and processed foods than than fresh alternatives. And across each and every single one of these, which are reducing the number of times they dine out, shopping for food based on price, consuming more packaged or processed food, reducing the quantity or quality of fruit and vegetables, eating less meat, and choosing foods that require no or very little cooking. For all of those measures, those in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland are more likely to report to be doing these behaviours. So that's a wrap from me for this wave. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I'll hand over.
So my name's Lesley Gray. I'm the Insight Director at Kantar, and we specialise in shopper behaviour. And what I want to share with you today...
Move in the middle if you're not going to stand behind
the
thing.
Is that better?
You can stand there, and you stand in front of it, but just not to the window because you won't get you on the speaker.
Ah, sorry. So anyway, Lesley Gray from Kantar, work in Scotland and have got the pleasure of decoding shopping behaviour. So for those of you that don't know Kantar, we are essentially have a panel of 30,000 households and we monitor the groceries that people bring into the home. So the best way to think about that is think about your shopping trolley and everything you've put in that shopping trolley in the past year. Multiply that up by 30,000 households, weight it up to the population of GB, and then compare it back to last year. So we can look at all those shopping trolleys and see how they differ from what shoppers have bought in the past year. We go back to 1976, which for those of you who are old enough in the room, the best-selling single in 1976 was Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree, and I'm not going to sing it this morning, but that's how long we've been doing it. We've had a 30,000 panel since 2011. So we have got a really syndicated view of shopper trends. I work in the GB panel, but we've got global panels as well. So Kantar love a segmentation. We love putting shoppers that have got similar traits in buckets so that we can segment what they're doing, and that's what I want to share with you today. So these are the three segmentations of our pressure groups. This is just under a third of our panel report on this, and it's actually quite similar to some of the information that Scott's been showing you. So what I want to draw your attention to is this is those that are comfortable, those that are managing, and those that are telling us they are struggling when it comes to their grocery spend. And we can see a slight increase in terms of our last wave of that. So August 2024 is when those that are comfortable have went up slightly by 1 percentage point. So they're comfortable and can afford most things. So slightly positive, struggling. Again, 22%, 1 in 5 are still struggling with their grocery shopping. Now, what's quite interesting, we monitor food inflation as well. So we've got a 70,000 product basket and we monitor the prices of everything in those baskets, and that gives us our food inflation. And when you look at a category, so a category could be fresh meat, it could be dairy, it could be packaged goods. And the inflationary pressures on shoppers as they shop for that category could come from direct inflation within that category itself. You've got categories within the food market that are still increasing above inflation. So chilled fruit juice, vitamins, vegetables are all increasing at over 4%. Our inflation in the 4-week ending period to August was 1.8%. So they're all increasing in terms of putting pressure on shoppers' baskets. Products that are decreasing are increasing below that inflation, cheese, butter, frozen fish. So the pressures on shoppers as they go round the supermarkets can come from within that category. It can come from the total basket of goods that they're shopping, and it can come from some of those wider economic pressures that Scott's talked about. So if we can deep dive into that category, we monitor all these different behaviours within a category. So if we look at repeat buying behaviour, say for the dairy category, we can work out if shoppers are buying more or less volume in order to mitigate those pressures. We can look at whether they have been shopping in cheaper stores. So have they been given a bigger percentage of their basket to Aldi versus Tesco? We can look at whether or not they're buying cheaper products, and that could be because they're shopping more on promotions, so they're taking more advantage of the promotions that are out there. Whether they have went from a brand to own label, and then within own label, have they went from that premium tier of own label down to standard, down to value? And is the product mix different? So are they buying different volumes? They might still be buying the same product, but they're actually buying less of it. So less kilos of fruit and veg, less kilos of red meat, for instance. And then they've got the exposure to inflation. And the reason for explaining all that to you is a kind of precursor to this chart, which looks really messy, but which I love. So I'm going to explain to you what that red arrow is. So that red arrow is when food inflation was 17.6%, okay? And everything underneath that showed how shoppers had changed their behaviour because of that high inflation. So what we saw at that time was they started to drop out of categories. So their category repertoire narrowed. They bought from less. They also bought less volume. They also changed their store mix. They shopped in cheaper stores. They also changed the brands that they were buying. They put more value brands into their basket. There was less promotions in the market at that time, so that ability to mitigate their overall cost was less. Now, if I can fast forward you to the most recent time period there, which was August, you can see there that we're starting to see product mix having a more positive effect. We're starting to see lessening of promotions. So the changes that we're seeing in behaviour has lessened in terms of that food inflation, which is what the brown line is there, which is 1.8%. So shoppers are very much impacted in terms of what they put in their baskets, what they take home to feed their families, and we monitor how that impacts. Now, food inflation has a direct correlation to health. And one of the categories that I thought would be worth showing is this is organic fruit and veg, so organic produce. And what you're seeing there, this chart goes back to 2021, so 3 years of data. On the left, we've got value, and on the right, we've got volume. And you can see how that has changed. So really how decreased. The red line is that 17.6% food inflation, but you can see it's starting to increase, but it's still only at 5.6% volume and 4.3%. So the food inflation has a direct impact on the categories that people pick and put in their basket, and some categories will be more impacted than others. This is my second chart that shows that correlation between inflation, shoppers and health. So what we're looking at is, this is from our usage panel. Our usage panel is almost like food diaries that our panellists keep. And what's really useful about that panel is that it's what they tell us, how they're cooking, what they're eating when they get those products home. Now, we know that it's not just claimed behaviour. We know that they're not overestimating how healthy they are or how good they are. It's like when the doctor asks you how many units of alcohol are you drinking in a week, and you always maybe take a couple off it. We've got their virtual shopping cupboard there, so we know that if they say that they've had a portion of fruit and veg, we can see from the receipts that they've bought it. So that makes that really powerful. And what we've started to see this year, so maybe Q2 of this year, is that the proportion of food that is chosen for health has started to increase. So again, similar to Scott's data, where we're seeing a slight increase, a slight more optimism in the market, we are starting to see this coming through in shopper trends. What we mean by the green bar for positive health is when you're putting something in your basket that actually helps health. So it could be you've put extra fruit and veg because you're trying to get your 5 portions a day. That's versus managed health, which is almost where you're picking up a product because it's got less sugar, it's maybe got less fat. So there's two kind of aspects to looking at health, depending on what the ingredients are. But positive health tends to be where you're actually doing something really positive because you know those products have got health benefits. So again, we're seeing a slight improvement as inflation's come down in terms of what they're choosing. And just to show that shoppers can be quite fickle and it's not always as easy as choosing products for food for health is this is us looking at scratch cooking. Now, everybody knows that the cost per kilo for scratch cooking is less, but what we are seeing is that need for convenience coming through. So there's been a lot of information in the media about ultra-processed foods, about the impact on your diet. And what we've been monitoring steadily for the last 5 years is the amount of scratch cooking has come down, whether it's for lunch, which is the bottom table, or whether it is for evening meals. So people are cooking less from scratch, and the reason for that is convenience. It's convenience, the need for convenience that is driving that. And again, similar to what Scott said, you're seeing this in families that have a lower social demographic status. So we can map that to that as well. So health is a bit of a, health can mean different things to different people. So even though people are looking to be healthy, they're wanting to be healthy, we're actually cooking fewer meals from scratch. We have a podcast. I'm just going to blatantly share our podcast. We talk about shopper trends. We talk about the economy. It's available there to decode. We share a lot of information on it. Thank you for listening. I think I've come in on time. Bit of a whiz through Kantar information there, but thanks, guys. There we go. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a slide.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Is this okay, Alan? Yeah, fabulous. Good morning, colleagues. My name's Manira Ahmad. As Susan described, I'm the Chief Officer at Public Health Scotland. I don't have fancy slides, though they've given a Glaswegian lassie a mic and then said don't sing or dance, so sorry, Susan. But a massive thank you to Susan for inviting me along to this space. And from a Public Health Scotland perspective, I've got a couple of minutes and I know we're going to go into a bit of a discussion, is around the importance of economy when it comes to public health priorities. So I'm not here to try and teach Granny to suck eggs. We know we're not in a good state when it comes to public health in Scotland. And I'm talking about the wider socio-economic determinants, not just health in hospital. We also know in Scotland we have an ageing population. And that ageing population in the next 2 decades, the burden of disease is going to increase by 21%. And most of that is going to come from our mature generation, and I'm just watching not to say the word old, but from a mature generation. And actually, I'm going to be in that generation in 2 decades. So what we're doing now will end up impacting, and I'm not saying this selfishly, but it will impact me as well. Lesley Ann and Scott shared real stark insights there, you know, and if those things don't make you wake or shake in your boots, I don't know what will. What we do know, economic inactivity is not good for human health. It isn't. And actually, we're in, the 4th or 5th wave of crisis with planetary and human health, so that climate and sustainability crisis climate emergency crisis that we're in. And I guess for me, there was a few things that I was noting, Scott and Lesley, and as you were talking, and then as I was reflecting on the report as well, and not to go through all the stats, so I'm a data geek, so I love it. So I think Scott and Lesley and I've done a tremendous job taking us through that. But one or two things that did come to me, and I thought it's not just a public sector reflection, but around how good, purposeful partnerships and decision-making require both public and private intervention, and actually more so now with the financial crisis that we have within Scotland. So we know we don't have enough money to spend within the public sector. We know that. We also know from the Scottish Fiscal Commission that every year we're spending 10.1% more than what we actually have. And that's forecasted for the next 50 years. And we also know, as you talked about, Lesley Ann, about food and behaviours, even at that level, they're disproportionately impacted. And Scott, you mentioned it, if you're from a deprived area versus a least deprived area. And one of the things within Public Health Scotland that we do know is that actually what we are going to be doing in around making decisions and supporting work is that the evaluation and research needs to be as robust as we can because we can't go out and try and do things several times. We need to be able to do things well tested, well formulated and projected. Yeah. And the other thing, I think the other kind of provocation that keeps going around in my head right now as well, the way we work within our systems in Scotland. So in some places we're doing tremendous work around that multi-agency approach right down to local system, right? But in actually in some other areas it doesn't even exist. And I guess it's a question for us as much as it is for everybody else in this room and those that will be listening to this afterwards, is around where the powers and spans of control are within our own realms and remits to start to agitate and be that instigator for that multi-sectorial whole system action. Susan, I don't want to take too much time, so just one or two things, and I promise I'll stop talking and I will not go and burst into song at all. The thing I want to talk about is the cost of living crisis, and both my colleagues that came up before me touched on that a little. And the report really goes into quite a bit of detail around that. But the thing that really jumps out at me is around how we are really taking an equity and just approach when we're delivering or thinking about delivering some of those services. And when I talk about that, as immigration was touched on, but actually we're in Glasgow right now, you know, and in Glasgow, within the city, yeah, if you look at the population, 1 in every 20 of us, 1 in every 20 are not even born in Scotland. Right, so that's rich culture we've got in amongst our economy, isn't it? Rich and diverse culture. But actually, are we designing and building services to really take advantage of that and really reach into the skills and knowledge and experience that comes along with that? The last thing I wanted to touch on, because when I was reading the report, and it's that optimism, Scott, you talked about, and our young people are quite optimistic, aren't they? So even in one of the points they talked about, you know, in the next 12 months, they see their financial position changing positively. Do you know, that's really good. But actually, is our systems in a place that nurtures that and will allow that to come to fruition? And I'm not going to stand here and answer that, because I think that's a collective discussion, and I would love to hear views from others around that. And the last thing I will say, and I promise this is the last thing I will say, is that I have the fortunate position, being in a national organisation, to spend a lot of time in local systems. And actually that community cohesion within local systems exists in tenfold. But our systems, our wider national and regional systems that set up, don't always nurture that. And actually this back and forth of applying for yearly or 2-yearly funding is really restricting the way we can think of the future. And some of that, I'm part of the system. So actually, if you think about who can actually change it, the leaders in this room are part of that system that make some of those decisions. So how can we start to come out of that cyclical 1, 2, 3 years to allow a lot of that localism to do what's needed across Scotland? I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to take my mic with me, or we're going to sit up here.
Just bear with us while we rearrange the... Fantastic. You have a seat, Scott. Right, so we're going to open up to questions now from the audience, so make sure you have your hands up ready and I'll come to you. I'm really struck, given all the headlines recently, Scott. So immigration's risen slightly, but trust in politics is still up there way higher than immigration. And we don't see that much about that on the media. So that was something that sort of jumped out at me. The precarity point, I think, came through really strongly in the Great Risk Transfers. So if you've not read the report we published last week, do have a read, because it's the link between the kind of things that Manira was talking about and the proportion of the population that's struggling. I love those categories, Lesley Ann, the struggling, managing and comfortable. And I think that's roughly how we've been thinking about, but not in the exact same words, of how the Understanding Scotland survey's been for a while, in that you know, a third. It's really coming through quite strongly. Right, over to the audience. What are your reflections and questions? Who wants to go first? If no one puts up their hand, I'm going to come to them. Craig, oh, fantastic. I'm going to come to you, Craig, in a minute. You came in last.
Hi, Kathleen Wiseman from Scott Pulse. Two questions, one for Lesley Ann and one for Manira. Lesley Ann, the chart that you showed about the scratch cooking, I'm just wondering, would COVID be a factor within that because people were more likely to be at home and more likely to be in the house and they could do more scratch cooking? That was just a thought. And the other question is for...
I deliberately showed that in a 5-year trend so that you could see pre-COVID as well. So we did see an increase during COVID because more people were in the house, more people had time to cook. So it did go up, but overall the trend
Still down.
is coming down, yeah.
And the other question is for Manira. The 1 in 20 stat for Glasgow is way higher than I thought it was. And I was just wondering, what is this stat for the whole of Scotland or indeed Glasgow conurbation?
Great question. Do I need to use a mic, Alan? Or? Yeah, use a mic. Great question, Kathy. Thank you very much. I don't have at my fingertips, but that's a really good point. And it wouldn't. So Glasgow, with the rich diversity, it's one of the cities that has the largest proportion of that diversity. So it wouldn't be as high as that moving outside of Glasgow. But there still is a large proportion. One thing I will say in and around that, and I'm not sure if your thinking went to that, is that actually with the movement around Scotland and the transient population that we do have, that changes depending on what's happening in and across Scotland. But I think there is leverage that actually what we do in some of our major cities could end up supporting what happens out in more of the urban and the rural areas. And a bit about, and I won't go into migration too much, but even the movement to where people are going based on the migration into Scotland as well. I don't see that, if anything, if we really are going to be as diverse as we want to be, it will increase. However, we have an opportunity right now to think about the frameworks and the systems and the way we encourage and embrace that diversity to really start to influence what we're doing. Sorry, Kathy, you just made me think of something else, if you don't mind me adding in. Just last week, and I'm hoping a number of colleagues in this room were able to go to this, there was the Healing Arts Scotland Week last week, which was 70, 80 events all across Scotland based on art and culture. Yeah, and normally art and culture is seen by some communities and links into the point about diversity, white privilege. Apologies, I'll just say that, that's how it's seen as. But actually, if you look at art and culture, culture is about even my mum using a 50-year-old recipe to make like dinner. You know, it's a bit of an art form, that creativity. And actually the spaces that we hold in local systems nurture that. But when it comes to, something happens when it comes to regional and aggregated to national level, we lose some of that localism. And what we're realising now is actually in places like Glasgow, where diversity is so rich, how we can bring some of those stories, that lived experience to life and actually hand the decision-making power. And we've got that in legislation anyway. We've got the Community Empowerment Act back in 2015 that allows communities to make such powerful decisions, make decisions around what impacts their place, around behaviour, and so forth. Sorry, I'm going off, so I'm going to stop talking, but great point, and we can pick up afterwards. Thank you, Kathy.
A quick question in, if that's all right. Lesley Ann, last time I saw you speak, I think we spoke about noodles and the rise. There's been a massive trend in people buying noodles, and one of the reasons might be for the pre-prepared food is the heating bills, and it doesn't cost as much to, boil a kettle and have a pot noodle or a packet of noodles than it does to cook from scratch. Is that coming through in the survey?
Overall, convenience, there's probably two drivers that are sitting behind it. The first is just the absolute convenience of it. but also the energy costs associated with it as well. So we saw a huge increase in air fryers. We don't just look at food, so we were monitoring sales of air fryers, and air fryers again have driven categories because it's cheaper to cook in an air fryer than it is to put your whole oven on, and that in itself has driven a whole load of NPD within the food sector, of products that are actually, new product development within the food sector that makes food suitable to put in your air dryer. So similar to noodles, where you're only maybe pouring a kettle, or similar to anything that's microwaved. As I say, you've had this energy cost associated with it as well, but it's definitely convenience. The number of minutes that it's taking to cook an evening meal, we're seeing that reduce as well. So just the whole preparation time. And as I say, you're more liable to have ultra-processed foods as part of a ready meal or a pizza or a product like that than you are if you are cooking from scratch.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for organising such a superb panel. And the information you've provided us with today has been incredible. You know, evidence-based policy is what we require, and so the information you've given us today has been exceptional. A question for Scott. In your second slide, I noticed that housing over a 2-year period had gone down from about a concern from about 32 to 16, and it was the one that was showing the greatest reduction. Was there any particular reason for that? And also a question for Marina. The last point you made about budgets and having more certainty for the future, I think this is something we need to expand and get more consensus over, because it's something I'm hearing time and time again, that to be able to deliver policies, you need certainty of budgets. And I think in the present environment, and so for the next Scottish Parliament, it should become an issue for us to perhaps be promoting. Welcome your views. But Scott, on housing.
Yeah, but and housing is one of my favourite topics. It's interesting that it has fallen kind of over the course of the time series, but it stayed at around the percentage it's at now for quite a reasonable amount of time. I think it was one of the areas where when you've seen cost of living just increase, it kind of fell away to be a sort of within that group of issues that are like below that top two. So I think it's probably to do with that. I'm personally surprised that it hasn't ticked back up. So if you look at all of the narrative around housing at the moment, you know, the declaration of housing emergencies, you know, firstly in cities and then a national housing emergency declared, and a big agenda around housing, frankly, that's, you know, I'd imagine will be part of the discussion going into 2026 election. I'm surprised that hasn't kicked up. That would be my reflection on that. I thought of issues, it's one of the high profile issues that people are talking about, and if, you know, I wonder if people also conflate some of the cost of living stuff. We're not thinking about when they're thinking about their housing costs, they're putting it into cost of living, and that's tempered it a bit, but I would have expected it to kick up a bit as well. And it'll be interesting to see as other issues emerge out now, will that be one of the issues that really begins to take hold, because it has an impact on economics, health, everything, frankly.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Ken.
Ken, great question, Ken. And I think I won't go into the detail about why we need to do it. I think we agree it's the right thing to do, and thank you for bringing up some of the points that actually, it doesn't keep me up at night, but it certainly takes a lot of my time about what we do. So can I maybe give you a bit of a perspective from Public Health Scotland of where our areas and realms of influence are? So one of the things that I'm definitely hearing, as well as my colleagues, is around the pressure that we put, especially in third and voluntary sector organisations, to go through funding applications. So again, sorry, I'm in Glasgow, so I'm just going to give you a Glasgow example. So in and around Glasgow, on one particular project, there were 78 organisations involved, right? And they all had to tender for funding, and this was for young people, actually children, early years. So if you think about it, these smaller organisations don't have expertise on how to do funding applications. Do you know, they're a bit of here and a bit of there. They'll be doing 3-4 jobs at the same time, and they're doing it 78 times. Then actually there's such a small pot of fund to go for, yeah? And then you get the money, And then you've got metrics around it, isn't it? You need to prove this, you need to make sure this is in it. So by the time you've got the money, you're kind of restricted into a box to deliver that service, aren't you? You can't really go outside and do that longevity, that horizon scanning. And some of that is, you're right, is because the scrutiny we need on public spend. So I'm not saying let's get rid of that, by no means, and this has been recorded, so I'm not saying that at all. But actually, there is no way to still be accountable and have that scrutiny and governance, but be a bit more long-sighted. So we know the evidence tells us over the next 2 decades the burden's going to increase in disease. We know that. So why not use some of that evidence to align funding cycles with? Yeah. But the biggest thing is, and I'll come back to, is economic inactivity. We have too many people that unfortunately are not well. We have too many people with comorbidities, unfortunately, and we're not doing enough preventative work. And until we start moving up into that preventative early intervention, we're going to be in that crisis of just managing what comes in the revolving door of our hospitals or our A&Es. So it doesn't answer your question, but I agree with you. There's back to this point about what we in Public Health Scotland can do from a policy perspective, but also how we can support some of the local systems so that 70 organisations are not applying for one pot of money, and how we can be a bit better at that. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you very much. So I'm Lisa Gallagher from Flexibility Works, and thank you for your presentation. So interesting to see all that data. And I'm quite encouraged actually by the increased optimism, maybe slightly surprised too, but it's really good. And all the shopping data, so fascinating to see it laid out like that. My comment is picking up just what you were saying there, Manira, just about the kind of trying to make sure people are healthy before it's too late and you're having to hospitalise people, and also what you were saying about that joined up working. So I'm going to give 2 examples of things that have happened to me personally, I've seen recently in relation to that. So one, I go to a little fitness class in our local library, and they've put up the prices by 75%. So now that class has to stop. So there's like 25 members of that local community that can no longer go and do fitness stuff because that class is ending. They're going to have to move it elsewhere. We've also got a little football pitch which belongs to our secondary school at the bottom of our street, which is fantastic, but it's locked up when it's not being used by the school. And so you end up getting teenagers breaking in because they're desperate to play football, which I think is a good thing, but then people end up falling off walls and doing all. And you kind of think that could just be open and those teenagers could be in there playing football and not doing other stuff. So so there's 2 things there. One, let's encourage people to be fit and well so we're not using the NHS so much later on. But also that joined up approach that you mentioned, which I completely agree with. We work with the Scottish Government in different ways talking about these sorts of things. But I'm just keen, that's just 2 very specific examples of how we're not working together and seeing the bigger picture. We're all working in our individual silos. I'll stop my rant. There we go. Thank you. Thanks.
Lisa, thank you very much for sharing that. I get a bit personal sometimes myself, right? So I try not to do that. So I'm glad you've done it. So thank you very much for doing that. Oh, well done, well done. I think it's that passing on of that kind of baton, is it? So thank you so much. So I live, and some colleagues will know this in the room, I live in one of the most deprived areas in Barrhead. So is anybody here from Barrhead? No? Hello? Have we met each other? Maybe. So I live in Barrhead, in exactly that. We have a gym, right, which they now have opened up to 11, 12-year-olds, but it shuts at 4 o'clock or 4:15 at the weekends. And what do the kids do? Hang about the play parks or in the cold, or vape, or, so we're actually setting up systems, spending lots of money, and then not making them accessible at the times that are needed. I think that's really spot on. The only thing I will say, and Scott and Lesley-Ann's data speaks around this as well, is that one sector alone can't do this. We've tried it in the public sector and we cannot alone shift that dial. We can't do it, right? And we require that multi-agency approach, and actually the resource, the intelligence, the knowledge that exists in private sector, we're not leveraging it the way we should. There's always going to be that hesitation about, public-private, but actually there's enough good examples of that coming together. For example, Robertson Group, they build houses, and they realised in some of the island communities where carers can't buy a house because of house prices. Yeah, they can't because of people with second homes and holiday homes, that they've went in and built some social housing, so that actually if a carer needs to purchase a house or live in the island, that they can do that on the wage that they're on. But then the care they're giving the community isn't that somebody gets tucked into bed at 5 o'clock. Yeah, they get their lives back in a sense because we're more flexible and serve. So I think, that's one little example. There's lots of those that go on. And I think some of us in leadership positions need to be a little more braver. Can I say that? A little bit, and I'm saying this to myself, and courageous to say, actually, this isn't working and we need a different set of people around that decision-making table. Back to your point, little more different diversity, but actually different sectorial response. And actually, let's hand over some of that wicked problems to others and get them in working with us. I'll stop there. Sorry, Susan.
Has been running a campaign on access to out-of-hours schools for years. So do get in contact with her if you're interested. Anyone else want to add to that question? No? I'll come round there. I don't know the best way round.
Thank you very much. My name's David Gray. I'm a consultant actually for Broadstone, so I do have an interest in data as well generally. But I have lots of questions, but I'll try and keep it very short. So to Lesley and Scott, what I wondered was, appreciate the sample size that you're looking at. Scott, you obviously have a lower sample size. So I'm wondering, and I know you do trends, so that's very informative, but is there also an assessment of statistical significance in any movements that you perform, given, as I say, we're talking small numbers, so it doesn't necessarily, and change in whatever, it might not mean that that's actually of significance. Related to that, Scott, just wondered, in terms of your tracker and the link to that's been done previously on risk transfer, do you do any assessment of insurance coverage amongst your population, and for example, in dealing with an emergency and the ability to deal with an emergency, which may come from loss of employment or something like that? And sorry, very lastly, for Manira, just wondered, you talked about sort of a rich and diverse culture. And like all of this, I think it's the evidencing any decisions or data evidence is a key factor, and it's a key factor, I think, persuading people, and it can challenge bias, prejudice, perceptions, all these things. So when we talk about rich and diverse culture, do we have an objective measurement of this? And I'm aware the Financial Conduct Authority has promoted diversity and inclusion, etc. I think they were also ambivalent to some extent on how powerful that was. I'm aware from my own experience of, say, the sort of, it's a fairly awful term, but groupthink, and the need to combat that and look at others' experiences. But again, I'd say the objective measurement is key there in terms of convincing people. And like all of this, as you've done, is the data to evidence that as well. So, but thank you all very much.
Thank you. Scott, do you want to start on?
On the first one, answer is yes. So basically, if you see a demographic difference reported in the report, or I've said it up here, it will be a statistically significant difference, and that's why we would highlight it. We wouldn't highlight something that wasn't. On the second part about the insurance, we've not asked that, but we are always looking for like different angles and different things to ask.
Related to it in the first Great Risk Transfer report 2 years ago, and there was a real scepticism on whether or not insurance was worth the money paid for it by people, and there were an increasing number of people not paying insurance because of that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I know just briefly the Financial Conduct Authority, it's a key one, Consumer Duty, that's come in and looks at fair value for consumers, so they are doing a big push on that. But it's in the insurance industry's interest to have products that meet consumers' needs.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, over to the rest.
Very quick, David, thank you very much for that question. I see you left the hard one to me, thank you. But no, so objective measurement, do we have one? And for me, I can tell you where we are on that scale. So we don't have clarity of it, but we do know that that what we have right now is disproportionate. But what I can share is some positive news is that though race and ethnicity is not a mandatory characteristic for even the services across health and care that's collected, though it was for during COVID, so we do have rich data around that, we're now building a race and ethnicity data set through the Race Observatory, so it's in academia along with health and a few other organisations and Scottish Government, local government involved in it. And the reason we're doing that is actually even the information we're putting out to systems. So Public Health Scotland do lots of analysis around data, and that is then used for performance measurement, service improvement, a whole host of things. There actually is, we don't bring an equity or just lens to it. So actually we're probably disproportionately or inadvertently impacting it in the wrong sense. So what we're doing now is being able to provide that equitable and just view with the race and ethnicities, and I'm hoping that then. Well, I know that those conversations are now started. How do we use that out with our service delivery, but actually our decision-making capacity? There's lots of work that's done, and that's the system has done around anti-racism reviews as well. I can point you to that if that helps, because that starts to answer some of what you've just talked about, David, as well. Thank you.
So, yep. There's one last question we've got time for. Yeah, did you have your hand up before? Yeah.
I don't think I need this. I'm having a look around. I think I'm the oldest person in the audience. So 1976, Tie a Yellow Ribbon might have been the best-selling single. It was also the worst single that came out that year. I was interested in your statistics about housing, like you, sir, and pensions. One of the most worrying things that I've seen recently for me personally is that which does an assessment of the amount of money you need to have in your pocket when you've retired to have a reasonably comfortable lifestyle. Okay, and the price of that has gone up 27% in the last year. So that's an issue for me, but I also think it's an issue for all the rest of you who are thinking about how much to put into your pension fund. Review it in the near future. The response to the housing crisis, I think, demonstrates that not enough people are thinking about what's coming up. There's going to be rent increases in the social, both in the social rented sector and in the private rented sector, but more so in the owner-occupied sector when the fixed-term mortgages come to an end. And I think not enough people recognise the more money they're going to have to pay for the property-owning democracy. Sorry.
Everything you've just said, I think on the kind of point about it's like a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because you've got a lot of young people, they're not thinking about their pension as we see, they're not thinking about it as an economic priority. But they don't have the housing wealth either. You know, they're not going to build up that, you know, finance for owning their own home because they don't own their own home. You know, they're paying the rents to someone else, which you quietly say are going to go up, and then they can't save that, so then they can't buy a house. Ultimately, it all comes down to supply, right? There's a chronic shortage of housing in Scotland, not just, you know, private housing, but also social housing. You know, it's not been replaced. It's obviously come out of the social sector. It's not been replaced. There's just a chronic shortage of housing, and it is a supply. It's a supply issue. We can argue. I think you can do all the things around the edges that you want with housing, but ultimately it comes into a matter of supply. And until something gives on that, then we're just going to keep having the same conversation over and over and over again about rent increases, lack of social housing, people not being able to get on the housing ladder. It's a supply issue, and that's that.
Yeah, do you see pension problems and the cliff edge coming as a public health problem?
I think anything related to finance is or economy is a public health problem. And as both Scott and Lesley talked about, is that it influences the decision, Susan. Do you know, that's the kind of the bottom line, and that's why being able to take that really multi-agency approach will help us combat some of it. I don't think it's going to totally, Scott, eradicate it unless you tell me that you've now got this magic ball and you know. I don't think it's ever going to eradicate it, but actually we can mitigate some of it. We can provide some actions into how we work as a system. But yeah, do you know, if there's not enough money in households and you put the figures up. If there's not enough money in households to look after people now, they're not thinking about the future. And then actually we know, and as the chief economist, Professor Graham Royce, told us, we're spending 10.1% more than what the economy has. So in 50 years' time, the economy's, if we don't change, it's not going to have anything in the system to give back unless we change.
So at this point, I was going to begin the close and come to the panel for one last sentence each. However, we're right on time. So I will say to the audience, please, if you've got any questions burning that you didn't get a chance to ask, grab the panel afterwards. I think it's quite important for those dashing off to meetings that I do finish on time. So I'll respect the clock and not give you the last word, if that's okay. I really do thank you all for coming this morning. Thank the panel for wonderful insights. I've still got a question there about Manira, are you happy seeing the number of takeaways go down? But we didn't get to that, so you can tell me afterwards, because I don't know if that's good for public health but bad for the economy, is it? I don't know. I'm just left with lots more questions. So please do stay for a few minutes. I think we've still got tea and coffee and refreshments outside. If you don't be strangers, for those of you who've not been to an event before, please do come along again. We have another one next week with Baroness Ashton. And in the follow-up, we will include the Great Risk Transfer report from last week for those of you that have not read it, because the two overlap quite a lot, and I think they're really good reading. So all that's left for me to do is to thank everyone.